We're live for our second live stream here with Mirr Ranch Group. I'm at Mirr Ranch Group headquarters, and this week we're going to be focusing on one of the most important things we run into as ranch real estate brokers, and that is water. You've probably, if you are a newsletter subscriber, you have read a lot of our pieces about water. It's going to continue to be an issue that we stress and that we help you manage through our services here at Mirr Ranch Group. And today, in order to kind of go over that water, we have two of our best ranch brokers in the biz who know a lot about water. The first is Tommy Latusik, and then the other one is Ken Mirr. Hi, guys.
Hey.
Nice to see you. And we gathered a lot of people's questions. We're going to try to answer as much as we can today. Continue asking questions as we go. But any of those questions we do not answer, we will answer after this live stream. So thanks for joining us, guys.
Sure. Hi, good to be here.
Perfect. Well, I guess, I'll just let you, Ken, talk about a little bit of the history of not only water, but I guess you and Tommy's relationship with water at Mirr Ranch Group.
Sure. The purpose of this is really not to provide kind of legal expertise. Although I went to law school and I took a class on water law, I clearly knew early on that there's a reason why people are dedicated their whole lives to water law, because it's its own business, it's its own specialty, has its own nomenclature. And so as we talk about it, we're talking more about our experiences that we've had, what we look for as we list properties or represent buyers and in due diligence issues, what we kind of come across and how it impacts value. I think that's kind of most important to people out there. And I do want to introduce Tommy. So back when we started Mirr Ranch Group, there was me, and then looking for some other dudes to hang out with, and I recruited Tommy for a couple of reasons. One, he's a good dude, and he's a Midwestern guy at that originally, and but more importantly, he had a real strong background on water and conservation, and so it was really blessed to work with them, and now we've become friends after all these years. I think, right, Tommy?
Oh, definitely. As far as you know.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, back in 2005 that I joined Ken, and at that point in time, I had worked for American Rivers, where I had worked on a lot of Colorado River issues, and that all came out of a master's thesis that I happened to write on Colorado River policy. So I was in not-for-profit river conservation for a handful of years, and then I moved into land trust work, which involved doing conservation easement transactions. So I think that combination of water background and conservation easement transactions has been very beneficial to doing ranch brokerage, because we broker large acreage rural properties that consist of water and mineral rights, also conservation easements and grazing permits and all the kinds of things that I dealt with in the land trust world, and then the water with the Colorado River side of things. So it's been a helpful background, and we've done a lot of transactions. We're not water experts in any way. We're really generalists. We have to kind of be comfortable in all of these myriad topics as we help guide our landowner clients through these ranch transactions. So
it's funny, we say we're generalists, but compared to 99.9% of the population, we're pretty good at what we do. And we are kind of the reason, Tommy and I work together along with the other brokers we really are thought leaders in this area. We know it. We don't just hire people off the street and say, hey, I'm good at sales, let's be brokers. It's really important to us to be knowledgeable, because these are very important issues that we work on in important landscapes. But as I said, we both Tommy and I both grew up in the Midwest, and the water issues in the Midwest are much different than the West. Even the water rights are back, east of the Mississippi are based on, riparian water right laws that if you're next to a river, you get to use that water. Whereas out West, we have a system based on prior appropriation, and it's basically first in time, first in right, with a whole separate filing process, a whole administrative process within each state within the West, where you have to, when you buy land, you look at the title. Well, title does not include water or water rights, so you have to do a separate water research. And there's a lot of things to be concerned about as you look at that water right. And not only do you want to have the age appropriate, older the right, generally speaking, the more secure that right and more valuable that right is. But how much is available in that stream or that canal or that ditch when it gets to your property. So we'll talk a bit about that some more as we get into it. But essentially, in Western water rights, you really it's all about putting that water that you do have to a beneficial use. And I brought up my handy dandy, by the way, great book. I'm not getting paid for this, but it's a water rights handbook from for Colorado, at least professionals, and it defines a lot of the kind of attributes and the beneficial uses. Essentially, it's broadly defined, but you're putting use to a lawful appropriation that uses reasonably efficient practices.
So I guess to interject, because you've used appropriation a few times, just for the people that, first time caller, first time user, what does appropriation mean for those that are listening?
Well, that's even a better one. Tommy, you want to take a stab at it?
Not to put you all on the spot here, but.
Well, appropriation, refers to when how a relevant water right was established in the first in time, first in right that we say a lot out West. So the older water right and the oldest water rights in Colorado, I think the oldest ditch is from the 1850s, and then in southern Colorado in the San Luis Valley. And then when settlers came into the Denver area, there were some from the 1860s and whatnot. So those are the oldest prior appropriated water rights. And the senior element of a water right is important in that, especially later in the season when water is somewhat limited, the more senior your right is, the stronger you have in the ability to divert that water to be used by you on your property. Some of the junior rights can be called, so to speak, and those properties, the water will go past those properties to the senior user. So that's where prior appropriation comes into play.
Okay.
With a lot of the landowners.
I guess with that, you talked about the Midwest and how it's different from Colorado. Are the Rocky Mountain states, do they all differ? Within Colorado itself, are there different water rights that people should be aware of? I know the Continental Divide has a lot to do with that, where water is flowing. I guess speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, well, and we'll talk a little bit more about, I think, as we go through this, a lot about the Colorado River in and of itself, and the over appropriation and just the many users that talk about it. But yeah, it is different because they're, we deal with a lot of, mountain properties, for instance, and like Tom, you're saying, he even worked on a project down there in the San Luis Valley, old water rights. You sit there and you find these early 1800 water rights, but you still come across these that might be not just in the state, but I was even working on water that came out of the Flaming Gorge, out of the Green River. That was a 1950s right, because that's when they built the reservoir, and that's when they started kind of putting that water to use. So the states all kind of follow the same kind of basic doctrine, right? But each state has a little separate nuance. They really do, as you go from Montana down to New Mexico and all the way across, to California. Everybody has their own little nuanced differences. And then, like you said, even within the state of Colorado, if you're located in the Front Range, for instance, and we were talking about, I think earlier today, Tommy, about Big Thompson water, and there's a right of use of that originally was created for irrigation, but now a lot of developers acquire that water rights for development purposes. So those water rights will have a separate value above and beyond the value that water provides in irrigating the land. So if you compare like a Big Thompson project, like in Boulder County, for instance, versus say North Platte River up near Walden, which is at 8,000 feet elevation, that water is really based on its added value to the land as irrigation water. Whereas the stuff on Big T is really now becoming a much higher right. It could be sold for much more value than the land itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right. And I think it's important to point out too that not all water rights. You talk about the value of water rights. The high value really comes from it can come from the geography of the water right and its location within a certain market. So that's why you see a lot of the ag water on the Front Range where we have this large population. That water can be transferred to a municipal use because of its proximity to that market. You've got a lot of water rights that we deal with on ranches, say in the mountains in Colorado. There isn't that same sort of transferability. Sometimes there are irrigation districts that don't allow you to transfer the water outside of that own district. And then there might not be the ability to say, if you have a ranch near Aspen, you can't necessarily sell that water to a market in Las Vegas or Salt Lake. So markets vary a lot. So if that market is just going to be in the immediate area around a ranch, that's one thing, versus a ranch that might be located in a municipal area. So not all water has the type of value that people think it has because of where the markets might be.
Yeah,
and I guess
not all water rights are created equal.
Yeah. There you go. In every sense of the word. And I guess that's a great segue. I know Tommy, Ken, you as well, but Tommy, I know you've had a lot of background with the Colorado River Basin, some of the properties that you have listed, but also your experience at CSU and American Rivers. And for those who are listening, recently, federally, it's been recognized that the Colorado River is officially in a drought. So, from your past experience, Tommy, can you tell us a little bit about how the Colorado River is different, some of the current issues we face, and then kind of what the solutions are and what private landowners are doing to help?
Right. Yeah, the Colorado River in the Basin has been in the news a lot lately. The Colorado River, obviously, headwaters state here in Colorado, starts here in Colorado as well as Wyoming, and flows through 7 basin states down through Arizona and California and New Mexico. And that's a very large arid area in the American Southwest. And it's really the only large river basin in that region. So all the water for that arid country has been divvied up. And it was actually 100 years ago this year in 1922 that Colorado River Compact was passed by Congress. And that compact is also called the Law of the River. And as they say, it divvies up the river between those seven basin states. And the total water rights in terms of acre feet varies from 4 million in California to 3 million some in Colorado to, I think, 300,000 acre feet in Nevada, which is Las Vegas. Problem is that was done 100 years ago, and the world has changed, and the amount of flow that they divvied up has pretty much changed as well. Back 100 years ago, they allocated the water amongst the 7 basin states from 14 million acre feet and change. Problem is, over time, we've discovered that the river doesn't flow quite 14 million acre feet, except in really wet years. The average is really more these days, probably in the 11, 12, 13 million acre feet realm. So that means it's over allocated in most years. And that's why we've seen the water levels in reservoirs go down to this point to pretty dangerous levels where it's going to be a challenge to generate power out of Lake Powell and Lake Mead are the main large reservoirs in the basin. So that's what we're dealing with now, is how to operate in an over-allocated river that's not receiving precipitation and the flows that the compact was designed for. So yeah.
And I guess, what are some of those solutions? I know, we work with private landowners. We also work with people like Western Rivers Conservancy. Are there good groups of people out there trying to figure out a solution to this? Do you guys have any examples that you've worked on?
Yeah, there is. They're all tough challenges, and every basin state kind of has its own interests that they're trying to protect. But this basin, there are 30 million people in it, in cities from LA to Phoenix to San Diego to Las Vegas, and some of the solutions are where each state might have to give up a little bit, and that's where that's a decision that was made in the last year or so. Every state is taking a little bit of a hit, especially the junior rights. Like in Arizona, there's some farmers in central Arizona that I think lost about 20% of their water rights. But there's also some market mechanisms that they're using, and then there's new water technology as well. But I know we've done some things with some of our landowner clients to be paid for keeping some water in the river. There's a program a couple of years ago that paid landowners to fallow their fields, forego a cutting or two of hay, and to be paid for doing that. I think they're going to return to that program to some extent. I think Ken had a client or two that maybe give some examples of that. But so there's a mix of market things going on, and then the states working with each other to try to leave more water and to kind of stabilize the reservoir levels.
Okay. Yeah, I guess what was the cottonwood? That was a big one you worked on.
There's a couple of cottonwood and porcupine, but before I move on, I think it's really important to think of this. Like Colorado is like the Mississippi of the West. It's a big river, supports a lot of people, and sometimes I even want to think of these things just globally. Water goes through different jurisdictions, like countries. I mean, there are fights beyond for countries for water rights as there are between states. And so when we talk about the Colorado River and the upper and lower basin states, we also got to bear in mind that there are rivers like in Colorado that flow to Kansas. So there's issues with Kansas making sure they get their water. There's issues, in Wyoming to make sure the North Platte River, they get their water. So there, and we think also down in southern Colorado, the Rio Grande flows into New Mexico. So there are still, the water starts in the mountains, right? And it flows down. We're also talking about kind of a lot of this surface water. Our discussion here today, at least, isn't really talking about groundwater, which is a whole different ball of wax. And I think we could talk about that in another conversation. By the way, speaking of which, I forgot to mention, it is International Water Day? International
Water Day, yes. Which is, we did not plan on that, so.
No, we did not.
Goes to show.
Of course we did.
Very important day.
It is.
As well as this National Ag Day, I might add. So I want to put in the context that, as to the Colorado, there are these unique things because of the the many people and the cities and the states with huge populations that are dependent on the Colorado River. I mean, you think of the states, and the cities, Phoenix, and and their use of that water, all the way down to Los Angeles and Vegas and all these places that are in deserts, right? So they need their water. So I just want to kind of put that in context and also talk about a little bit when Tommy's saying the need. There is the upper basin states, Colorado being one of them, we need to provide right now like 7.5 million acre feet, I think, of water to the lower basin states. So that's a requirement. And if it's not there, what do we do, right? So this is where you start getting into these issues of some junior right holders losing their rights. If they're post 1922, there's a real value issue versus pre 1922. So bear that in mind as we kind of have these discussions. And again, really talking about surface water in and of itself. But yes, we did. I've worked on a couple of projects. One up in Wyoming, and the Wyoming Range. The water from the Wyoming Range and some of the Wind River flows into the Green River. Well, that Green River actually flows into the Colorado River. So that water there, just south of Jackson Hole, flows all the way down to New Mexico, or down to the Gulf of Mexico, I should say. So, so as these water shortages started happening, or fear of these water shortages were occurring, the lower and upper basin states got together and said, hey, why don't we create a program and test this out and see how the market works. And so they did create a pilot project, and it basically provided compensation for landowners to voluntarily and temporarily, two words very important, voluntary and temporarily, fallow some of their fields. And in one case, I believe in Colorado, a property owner that we worked with was in Drought County, south of Steamboat. By following, say, 2,000 acres or 20% of the ranch temporarily for a year, they were able to receive over $400,000 of income for that temporary and voluntary reduction of use. So that program's not around right now. It was a test kind of pilot project, as they say, but I think there's a lot of those things being talked about, and it just goes into the whole decision-making of buying a ranch and owning a ranch, what that value of your water right is. So
right.
Yeah. And I've got a good example that kind of brings into play all of those things that we've talked about in terms of value, Colorado River, even abandonment, and then senior water rights too. I have a current listing now called The Farm on the Colorado out in the Glenwood Springs area, which is, upper basin and upper Colorado River. This property is an 1,100 acre property with 2 miles of the Colorado River. And it's got, it irrigates about 300 acres. And that means it's got a pretty sizable water right. And it's also a very senior water right. Almost all of the rights it holds are pre-compact from 1905, 1910, around there. So this is a property that's so senior that it's never been called. There's never been a senior water right up or down that needed the water, and the water did not get to the farm on the Colorado. So that makes it valuable. Water's never been abandoned, and it's water that even last year in a drought year, it was watering. They watered from April to October, never missed a beat. So those are the kind of things, the context that we look for when we value a property and value the water on it. So this farm on the Colorado has very valuable water rights, and as a result, it's for sale and getting a lot of action because people understand in that context what that water means these days, especially being a Colorado River Basin property.
Right. And in addition to valuation, as ranch brokers, can we help new landowners figure out how to manage these rights that they're coming into play with as they purchase properties? Do we have the tools to connect them with the right lawyers, connect them with the right managers, because I know it can seem overwhelming sometimes when you have something as valuable as a water right, but you don't necessarily know a lot about the agricultural component or how to use it or the abandonment rules and all of those things.
Well, we do have that proprietary software that we utilize. So like in any of our deals, when we take on a listing or representing a buyer, before we even go to any water attorneys or whatever, we do our own due diligence, right? We do,
Right.
Even for the listing, because sometimes even when we're listing, the owner knows enough, but we need the details, right? So we'll do that evaluation up front and get a better understanding of where that water right sits in that particular area, drainage, how it competes with other landowners along that river area. So we'll do that at first. Yeah, we certainly know, we just did, heck, I was even working on a deal with, this wasn't so much irrigation, but it was a water right for ponds in southern Colorado, for instance, and had a dam on it, that, was built in the early 1900s and still there on a hillside. And then it had ponds on the ranch that were built years ago, but they were never permitted. All these unique situations. So we had to bring in a dam safety engineer, inspector, as well as water attorneys, and just double check the status of that water right to make sure, what the status were on these rights, because they're, and this is beyond irrigation.
There's losing it a little. Tommy, can you hear me?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. I can hear you.
And Tommy, you've had that same situation. I mean, hiring water guys, and we do utilize attorneys once we get a little over our head.
Right. Yeah. As I mentioned, we're generalists, so you need to be conversant in a lot of different topics. So we are quick to use water attorneys. And I also want to mention water engineers too. I think there's a big water engineer industry, and these guys are really often the kind of the right-hand man for water attorneys. They kind of do a lot of the on-the-ground research to find more context for an actual right. They'll get out there on the ground and talk to ditch riders and things like that. So there's a
ditch
lot
riders. People don't know that term, right, Tommy?
Sorry.
What's a ditch rider?
A ditch rider, right?
Yeah.
There are the local folks that really kind of watch the ditches and the diversions. They'll do the actual diversions quite often and roll the wheel and lift up the gates to turn water out onto properties. So they're the ones that really know what's going on, and they'll call landowners and talk about conditions and in a drought year, what sort of limitations they're going to run into. So ditch riders, water engineers, those are really, again, the eyes and ears for the water lawyers. You'll see a water right on a piece of paper. Water rights inventory list, we'll often call it. But sometimes when the rubber hits the road, so to speak, the reality is different. And so these guys really kind of help flesh out that whole picture.
We can't hear you, Haley. But part of this, I think, really was to kind of identify with landowners, buyers, and sellers the importance really of knowing how water adds value to your, to the asset, and knowing that as you walk into these issues, right? What's important to look at, how that water adds value. And in the end, how we're even still working on water issues today. I think, Tommy, I think of some properties that we have where everybody's asking, well, what's the blue sky value of my water right? You know, maybe there's no demand or secondary market right now for that water right, and it's really the value that it contributes to the land. But we all know if this drought continues, that in the future, these water rights will take on different values. That's something we haven't really figured out yet. I think that's something, a shoe yet to drop.
Right. We haven't touched on the value just recreationally and ecologically.
Right.
That's a big component of a lot of our properties. We work on a lot of properties that have fisheries, and the level of the water can be changed by ag diversions downstream, upstream really. So there's a lot of elements, not just in terms of developability and Colorado River issues, but ecologically and recreationally, where that water will really add value to a property. You can think about a property, with its water rights or without water rights, and there's an intrinsic value to possessing those water rights, and some of those values, that context is going to change in the future. We're just not familiar with it, but we know that water, is a need and always is going to have an extreme value. So that value can change over time and may very well increase exponentially in years to come if you have a ranch property that possesses that kind of water.
Yep, that's right. So, I think, we'll see this, depending on how much this drought continues, what happens there, as that impacts, water usage and water values. And I think all the states will respond probably similarly, but, they're all going to have their different, ways of approaching this. And I think you've already seen that probably in your practice too, of different states and how they deal with it. But I think, I guess really, to finish it off, it's just the water. Water is probably one of the most important criteria. And you look at these places. We do sell ranches that are dry land farms or dry land ranches that the only water rights really on the property are the water rights, and wells or groundwater to, provide water to cattle. But as we get into these, more of a properties that have irrigation rights based on surface water issues, that's a big deal. And I had seen some stats I just saw recently that, compared to like where we grew up in the Corn Belt, where 93% of the water that is used comes from groundwater, over 70% of the water we use for irrigation in the mountain states come from surface, and only 25, 26, 27% come from groundwater. So that's why it's a big deal in the West.
Right. Well, and you brought up groundwater, subsurface water. I think that's a topic for a whole nother live stream at some point. It's a big source of water, and you look at Arizona and California, and then certainly parts of Colorado too. But that's a whole nother topic for another day. Today was a little bit more about surface water and that side of things here in the West. So
yeah. Well, we try to get to some of those questions that you all provided. I hope we were helpful in doing so. I think we'll revisit these kind of other water issues like groundwater and subsequent episodes. And Tommy, as always, appreciate your foundational experience.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciated enjoyed the chat here today.
Yeah. And everyone, just stay tuned for one of the next episodes, and we'll keep you up to date. And thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks, folks.